Hello. G'day, everyone. I'd say it's nice to see you, but the house lights are in my face and I can't really... Can people up the back hear me? Yes? Excellent. G'day, everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and thanks so much for coming along to Politics in the Pub this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this evening, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And make sure that you head on over to the Uluru Statement from the Heart website to find out what you can do to be part of the referendum later this year. I'm very proud to be supporting the Yes campaign. We do love doing these events, and we love that you all come along to Politics in the Pub. We really love that the Canberra public gets involved and engaged in these public policy debates. It's so important to strengthening our democracy and making sure that you're informed and that policymakers and others can consider the views of the community. We think it really helps drive better politics. We do pride ourselves on making Politics in the Pub free to the public, and thank you all for coming out every month, but they're not free to put on. So if you can chip in, there's a donation box at the back and a tap and go by the bar if you can chip in a little bit to help to help the Australia Institute make sure we can keep doing Politics in the Pub. So I'm really excited about tonight because I know housing is a red hot issue in Australia at the moment. Many young people can't afford to buy a home, and many more than that are really struggling even to find an affordable place to rent. Homelessness is a huge problem, and the Labor government's housing bill in the Parliament is looking to set up the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is supposed to invest $10 billion as a fund, and using the proceeds of that or the dividends from it to build 30,000 affordable homes, just using the earnings from the fund. Obviously, there's a huge amount to get into this evening when it comes to housing affordability. So to help us see the full picture, I'm delighted to walk us through a couple of the issues we'll be touching on this evening, hopefully some big, bold solutions. And I'm delighted to introduce our panel this evening. Greg Jericho is Policy Director at the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work and my colleague, and a columnist at The Guardian. I'm sure you've read him in there. Maiy Azize is spokesperson for Everybody's Home, Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia, and a fellow at the Australian Basic Income Lab. And Joel Dignam is Executive Director of Better Renting, a community of renters working together for stable, affordable and healthy homes. Please give our panel a round of applause. So, Maiy, I wonder if I can come to you first. I've just kind of roughly touched on the Housing Australia Future Fund, and that's really all about social housing. Can you tell us, just to kick us off, what is social housing and what is the Housing Affordability Future Fund? Did I get that right? Housing Australia Future Fund? Yeah, just to kick us off.
So social housing is housing that's provided by the government or the non-government sector, not for a profit. And what social housing means has actually changed a little bit in Australia over time. So back between the Second World War right up to the mid-80s, a lot of average working people lived in social housing. Today, social housing has got a much narrower definition. It's for a much narrower group of people. Basically, social housing today is for people at the absolute margins of society, people who really can't afford to rent in the private rental market at all, people who are really unlikely to be in paid work, and so that definition has really narrowed over time. The Housing Australia Future Fund, as you touched on, is this fund that the government is proposing to set up. This has its roots back in the Labor Party's loss at the 2019 election, where they had an agenda for tax reform that included winding back some negative gearing tax concessions, and they also had a plan to build 300,000 social and affordable rentals. So
300,000, is that Is that how many people are waiting for social housing?
No, so 640,000 people across the country need social homes. Yeah. But 300,000 is no mean, let's not, that's not, it's definitely, that would have been a life-changing, commitment for a lot of people around the country. But we all know what happened in 2019. The Labor Party lost. It inferred a bunch of things. It inferred a bunch of reasons about why it might have lost. And in 2021, they unveiled this fund as the centerpiece of their housing policy. It's designed to be cost neutral. So the idea is that they put $10 billion into investments, and they use the dividends from those investments to offer incentives to developers to invest in community housing. And they hope to build 20,000 social homes and 10,000 affordable ones.
Okay, that kind of gives us a picture of the scale of the problem.
300,000 to 20.
As an ambitious target. I mean, the other thing about the fund, I'm sorry to spend so much time talking about it, is that comparable funds like the Future Fund and the Medical Research Future Fund haven't been making money in a while. They've been returning losses, and building costs have gone up. So there's a bit of skepticism about whether this fund can actually meet those targets.
Yeah, right. So that gives us a bit of a picture on social housing. But Joel, if I can come to you for the picture for renters in the private market, what does that look like at the moment?
Yeah, it's a bad picture. And I think one corollary to what Maiy was saying about how there's so much less social housing now is that people who a generation ago would have been in social housing are now trying to go and enter the Hunger Games of the private rental market. And so there's a lot of people in social housing because they face lots of disadvantage. But a lot of people who are pretty similar in other ways just don't have the opportunity to be in social housing and end up in the private rental market alongside a whole lot of other people who may have more resources but still really struggle. I think what we've been hearing a lot about over the last year is the rent increases that people are seeing. And that probably is, I guess, on ramp to understand all the different ways this affects people. So if you're lucky enough to get to stay in your home and afford that rent increase, your budget is still more stretched on top of everything else. We hear so much about energy prices going up. I mean, we are hearing a lot about rents going up as well, so that's something, but this is normally your biggest household expense. So if that's going up by 10%, that's a pretty serious impact on you. A lot of people can't afford that, so it forces them to move and then try to find somewhere else. They pull their kids out of school, maybe they have a longer commute to their job if they can actually get another place. And of course, what we tend to see also is that when rent increases are higher, rates of homelessness are also increasing. It really is the other side of that coin. But of course, for renters, you don't want to get that rent increase. You don't want to be forced to move. And so what we also see is people being really unable to exercise the rights that they have on paper as renters. And so people will not make a fuss about the fact that their air conditioner hasn't been repaired because they don't want to do anything that could jeopardize their existing tenancy, or they'll move into a place that has littered with black mold because it's the only place that they can get and they're desperate. So I think it's not just you've got less money in your pocket at the end of the week. It's also that, like, do you even have a place? And also, what is the quality of that place? How well can you actually make it a home when you're so unable to exercise your rights? And unfortunately, I think in the market as well, at some level, certainly real estate agents and to some extent private landlords understand what's going on, of course, and they feel much less obligation to be proactive about addressing these sorts of issues and getting on top of these things.
Yeah, I think if you were at last month's Politics in the Pub with Adam Bent, you might have heard I've got an investment property, and the real estate that I use wrote to me and was like, we've assessed your property, rental prices are going through the roof. We think you can get $50 more a week for your rental property, and we're going to put it up unless you write back to us and say, don't do it, which alarmed me. And if that's how rental agencies are operating, and that's an opt-out thing, not an opt-in thing, you can see why things got so dire so quickly. Greg, housing affordability for people who are looking to buy a house, you wrote a recent column on that, and things are looking pretty grim for younger people, yeah?
Yeah, pretty grim is putting it pretty nicely. It's utterly shocking, especially when you compare it to previous generations, and that's one of the things I did in my paper was my article, I won't call it a paper just yet, is I thought everyone sort of thinks about, you know, the traditional thing, and this certainly something that applied to me and my wife was when we're in our late 20s, early 30s. Like we've been working for a while now. We've been renting. It's time to buy a place, even if it's a small place. We bought a townhouse, and many people do that. And I thought, okay, so let's have a look at what's the average mortgage that people were paying. And the ABS's figures going all the way back to 1975. But I thought, okay, I'll start from people who turned 30, 31, who were born sort of 1946. So your stereotypical first boomers. And then sort of did it every 5 years right through. And really, and then I thought, okay, well, we all know it's gone up at inflation, everything. So how do you sort of compare it? And I thought, well, one thing I'll just do is compare it with average earnings, just one person average earnings. And I know this is not realistic because back in the 80s, generally most households, you only had one earner. Now most you have two, but I wanted to really highlight just how massive things have changed. And essentially back in the early 80s, for those sort of first boomers buying a house, the average mortgage was about 2 and a bit times the average earnings. And now it's about 9, you know. And now if we just look at households, which takes into account that more people work now, the figures are not quite as bad, but it's still well more than double times. You know, sort of has gone from about 4 times the average household income to now about 10 times. So still a significant amount. And it's one thing that is just so obvious, however, is that the real jump sort of occurred in that late 90s to about 2010, real big jump there. And then there's been another super big jump in the last 5 years that have just, we sort of after the GFC, things kind of did calm down a bit, apart from in Sydney. And there was this sense of maybe there's a chance, you know, and then it just took off again. And one of the other things then I thought I did, well, what do we hear when we talk about housing? Everyone goes, oh, yeah, but hey, we paid 17% interest rates back in 1989 for a month. They never sort of highlight how rare it is. So I thought, okay, what I can also do is work out what are people's average mortgage payments as a share of your income. Because one of the things is we often sort of do that over time, but it goes up and down. But of course, if you take out a home loan, your home loan is fixed. You're not, you know, you take out a $300,000 home loan, that's your home loan. And so you can, but your income will go up over those 25, 30 years or whatever you're paying it off. And so I thought, right, I'll try and work that out. And yes, if you took a home loan out in 85 or around 1990, you did have some fairly high mortgage payments as a percentage of your income, but they went down fairly sharply and kept going down fairly sharply because incomes back then were growing very strongly and interest rates were going down. Now for sort of, I guess, the millennials who were reaching 30 and sort of and thinking about buying a house around 2005 and into 2010, they started up with a very high mortgage share of income, and it really didn't go down too much, and it's just zoomed up incredibly in the last year, obviously. So they're actually doing worse off now, even though the cash rate is at like at 3.5% or 3.6%, which is historically low. They're paying as much of their income or more of their income now than did those who were paying 17% back in 1989. So it's a real indicator of, yeah, we've got low interest rates now, but the actual size of that mortgage, getting a deposit, buying that house is just, it's up there. It's well away from what most people can actually even sort of aim for.
Yeah.
Question. I've just got a follow-up question. Thanks, Greg. It occurs to me, so you've looked at the average mortgage in sort of 5-year intervals, but the properties people would have been buying in 1980 would have been quite different properties from what millennials are buying in 2010. So in quality adjusted terms, I imagine it's even worse.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's unfortunately something that we can't quite, we don't have, say, a per acre or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it really is a case of the size of the block you were buying back in 1980 is vastly larger than it is now. And it's a case of not only paying more, you're paying more for less in a sense. So you're really getting smacked both ways. And I just think about, and it was one of those things I wrote a couple of weeks ago. I was just talking about interest rates, and I wanted to highlight that actually for most people who took out a loan 15, 20 years ago, they're still paying mortgages that are lower than they originally were because interest rates have gone down. They've gone up a bit, but haven't got back to where they were back in, say, 2005. But if you took out a loan anytime from like 2017 onwards, you are now paying a lot more than you used to. So I wanted to sort of highlight that and sort of say, well, this is pretty much the younger homeowners are getting smacked. And I had so many people getting in touch with me on Twitter, even emailing, sort of saying, that's me. Yep, I'm exactly that person, took out a home loan 29 and we're getting smashed. And that every single person who did that also said, but at least I've got a home and I don't want to whine too much because I know how lucky I am. And I'm just thinking, people my age, people my parents' age, never ever would have thought of apologizing for the fact they own a home and that they're in some ways lucky, because that's just what you did once you got to that
how it
certain
was.
age. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So that's a pretty grim picture, right, folks? How did we get here, Maiy?
Well, just to go back to what I was saying earlier, and it also touches on what Greg was saying about how ownership used to be an expectation. Back in that era that I was talking about earlier, between the Second World War up until the mid-80s, there were basically three kinds of housing situations in Australia. There were people who owned their own home. There were people who were renting, and that was pretty temporary, pretty transient, and they were saving to buy a home. And there were people who had secure lives in social housing, right? So those were the kind of the three kinds of people. In the mid-80s, the Australian government, but governments all over the world really, started walking away from building homes as their main intervention in the housing market. Before that, Australia used to build about 30,000 social homes a year. So we talk now about this special fund that, might build 30,000 homes over 5 years. We used to do that every single year, back at a time where our population wasn't growing as much, and that was a huge proportion of the homes that was built. 1 in 4 homes that was built back in those days was actually built by the government.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that did a few things. It meant that there were people who could expect security, paying good, a good solid rent, and have a life in social housing. But it also drove affordability for people who were renting, because the government had such a share and sort of so much leverage in the rental market. In the mid-80s was really when the government started to walk away from building social housing, funding social housing. That pushed state and territory governments into really narrowing who was eligible, because they just didn't have the money anymore for the upkeep, for the investment. They started selling off social housing, and then we sort of started seeing a lot of demand side assistance coming in the 90s. So Commonwealth rent assistance was introduced, and the idea, when all the speeches were given in Parliament at that time, was that this would save us money on social housing. And rent assistance now, depending on the year that you look at, costs between 3 and 4 or 4 times more than what we spend on social housing. And then we brought in negative gearing. We brought in all these things. So actually, the really interesting thing is the government thought it was going to save itself money. It spends record amounts now on a system that's extraordinarily expensive, not just for the government, but also for the people who live in it.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, Maiy, it kind of reminds me of when you hear about the American health system, where they spend vastly much more money than Australia does, and it's all private sector, all that type of driving. So it's one of those things where governments are able to say, oh, look how much we're spending, but it's just this bullshit spending on the market,
and it's for worse outcomes.
That's absolutely right. And then the other part of that, and this is where Joel's interests really come in. It's turning much more towards the private market. It's relying on the private market to deliver, rentals for people and affordable homes for people, and assuming that it can do that. But absolutely none of the rules around renting, or a few of them have been, sort of here and there on the margins. I know we're in the ACT, but for the most part, the rules around renting and the culture of seeing renting as a temporary thing haven't really changed as we've become more reliant on the private market.
Yeah, and shout out to the ACT government when they changed the laws around being able to have pets in rentals. I took advantage of that one pretty quick smart. Joel, what are some of those things that we need to do to help make renters be more secure, and how do we fix it?
Fantastic. Thank you. So I think I'm coming off of Greg's point, because it really follows on from that, is that there's a whole lot of people who aren't going to become homeowners. And I think at the moment, this is a pretty big political issue, and it is going to be a huge political issue when these people begin to retire. So we've got a few decades, but I think we should maybe get cracking a bit faster. And we really have a setup that punishes people for being renters and almost sort of drives them to try and compete in the ownership. And what I like about making renting better is we not only improve conditions for a whole bunch of people who are going to be in the rental market, but we also make it viable for people to be in the rental market if they want to, and take some of that in sort of confected demand out of the ownership space. And so I think we need to start from the place of more people are renting long term. This is their home, and what does it mean to have a home there? We think about sort of stability, affordability, and the quality and healthiness of these homes. So we've seen action in jurisdictions, including the ACT, around making it so that there actually has to be a decent reason to end a tenancy. So the ACT, just at the start of this month, ended no cause terminations. So now it's quite big, and I appreciate it, but really what they've done is said that you need to have a reason to end a tenancy. So big step forward there in the ACT. Other jurisdictions around the country have not yet been so bold, but the new Labor government in New South Wales has committed to that, so we'll wait and see. The stability, very important. Let's let people stay in their homes like they want to. Affordability, there's various levers you can do here. We are seeing a growing talk about what it means for governments to actually regulate rent increases. Last year, I traveled to New York and San Francisco, and like rent increases, rent caps are really part of the norm there. Rent controlled apartments, rent stabilization. And you hear a lot of like the economists like to say this and that about rent controls. But I think talking to someone who's been able to like remain in their community, to be able to afford to stay and like be part of that community, connect to their neighbors long term, is probably the sort of intangible benefit that economists often aren't so good at getting a grasp on. And I certainly think like when the problem is rents being increased too rapidly, maybe the solution is stopping rents from being increased so rapidly.
Yeah,
is my bold idea. And then I guess
that's
third,
pretty far out, Joel.
And then I think the third sort of thing we think about, I mentioned earlier, people being driven into some really marginal accommodation. People might have seen in the news just earlier this week that uninhabitable place in Greenacre, New South Wales, being put up for rent. People really being, you can get away with renting out whatever you want these days, even if sometimes it's against the law, but you get away with it. Sometimes it's not against the law. So we are really interested in what we can do to actually improve the standard of what's being put out there in the rental market. So the ACT, again, a good leader here with its ceiling insulation requirement. We've seen other jurisdictions be a bit more specific about other sorts of standards that people might expect. So that's all looking pretty good. And I think we will see more of that, hopefully. We do still have this fundamental issue of the power imbalance. And a lot of the models that governments have come up with still rely upon the renter to basically stick their neck out and say, hey, there should be ceiling insulation in this roof. For the renter to do that is a pretty big ask. So I think things like ending no-cause terminations make it easier for the renter to do that. But I think really the more we have a high vacancy rate, the more there are available rentals, the more we have more social housing, the easier it is actually for a renter to do that, more comfortable that they're not going to get kicked out. And if they are, they'll have somewhere to go.
Greg, it strikes me that the Australia Institute in the past has done some work around capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. But before we get into the weeds of tax reform, which I know you're all waiting on bated breath to hear Greg talk about, our executive director, Richard Dennis, has pointed out in the past that, of course, we offer lots of public housing with no shame attached for people like the Prime Minister, who's got 2 public houses to enjoy. And we've got a little thing called the Defence Housing Authority Association. I never know what the acronyms stand for. I'm so sorry. But we do invest in public housing, but not for everyone.
Yeah, and I goes to sort of what Maiy was sort of talking about when we often hear, just to speak about a hypothetical politician who talks about how he grew up in public housing. The thing with that politician is that when he was in public housing, that was a hell of a lot more common than it is now. So it wasn't a case of, oh, you lived in public housing in the 70s and 80s, or you must have the ass falling out of your pants or something. It was, I grew up in public housing for the first sort of until I was sort of about 10, because my dad was a school teacher and we lived in the South Australian education home. We rented that in our country town in South Australia. And it was, I wouldn't have even thought it was something weird or anything. It was just, and because I knew other kids of teachers who did the same. And you're right, it's this thing of we are okay with public housing for certain things like Defence Housing Australia. Oh yeah, that's just taken as given. And while there are some, I was having a look just to see if there was still this South Australian Education Department housing. It's there in sort of a mega scale for out in the vast regions, but not for the most people living in capital cities who are struggling to find a place to rent. And it's the same case around all states. And so it's this sense of as Maiy was saying, we got to really get out of this, get back to what it used to be of actually it's not for those who are basically on the poverty line or just, it becomes a common thing and actually becomes in some ways a nice foundation for the entire housing market, for the whole system, that it gives people some security, some safety, that they're actually able to then plan ahead, be able to budget to save. And because there would be that supply, that brings down the pressures elsewhere.
Yeah, I was just going to, if it's okay, just jump in and say a few things about that. I mean, one of the things that we hear about a lot is there's so much hand-wringing from government about this, about sustainably funding social housing. And that's one of the reasons the government is so keen on this Housing Australia Future Fund, because, they want a quote unquote sustainable, mechanism for funding social housing. One of the ways that you can make this system work better and be more viable is to have people on higher incomes in it paying rent. That's why defence housing works so well. That's why defence housing makes money for government, actually, because it's for wealthy people who pay into it. I was going to make another point about this. This isn't, I think this relates to what we're talking about, but I did a piece of research in 2018 about people's attitudes towards welfare. And one of the findings from that piece was that the most popular aspects of the system are the age pension and Medicare, and they're the most universal. You have to be on a pretty high income you have to be very wealthy in Australia to not at least get a part pension when you retire, and everyone on any kind of income gets Medicare rebates, and it's been pretty unpopular when the government has tried to tinker with either of those things. So one of the big lessons that we took out of that at Anglicare was that universalism is really important. The way to make some of these cornerstones of our social security system, and in this case kind of our housing system, more secure, is to expand them to middle class people. It makes it a lot harder for the government to tinker with them. It really improves kind of public buy-in.
If more people have a stake in it.
Absolutely, yeah. It becomes harder to marginalise the people who use those services.
Yeah, and now I did promise some tax reform speak from Greg. So Greg, capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, how do they distort the housing market?
Well, they distort it massively. And I just sort of, before I get right into the weeds of that, when we think about housing assistance and government policy, as I think Maiy was pointing out, and the thing is, since sort of the late 80s and through to the 90s, all of it's become demand driven about, it's hard to buy a house. Okay, we'll help you, give you some money so that you can buy a house, rather than come at it from the other way. And what that has led to is this belief that housing prices are always going to be supported, always going to be lifted. And we saw this in spades during the pandemic, where when you compare to what happened during the GFC, where the Rudd government was like, right, we're going to build a hell of a lot of school halls and buildings that these public schools all around the country need. We're going to do that. The Morrison government was like, well, we're going to need lots of construction. What are we going to do? We're going to do home build. We're going to give money to the private sector, and that's going to boost up housing prices. And God did it. But even before we get there, the big one is certainly negative gearing and the capital gains discount. And actually, negative gearing kind of gets a bad rap. It's probably because it's just everyone thinks about, you can sort of joke about the boomers negative gearing everything, and the comedy line, I forget who says how it'd be so bad they'll be getting buried with 2 coffins so they can negative gear the other coffin and things like that. I think it was Tom Ballard who said that. But really, the big crime of Distortion is the capital gains discount, which came into being in 1999, 2000. John Howard and Peter Costello changed it, and it had a massive impact on the attractiveness of negative gearing. From before then through to the 80s, there'd be a few people negative gearing. It was there, but no one really cared about it. It didn't have a huge impact on anything. Then when they changed the ability of how you were taxed on your capital gains, it went from being this really technical, wonderful indexation against inflation to, right, you can just get 50% discount on how much tax you pay if it's a capital gain. Suddenly that meant buying a house, renting it, you could negative gear it and get the tax benefit from that negative gearing. And then when you sold the house, when it's gone up in value, you're paying half the level of tax you would on your own income. And so suddenly you're winning both ways. Whereas in the past, it was kind of, there was not much benefit in selling that house because it was all taxed according to inflation. So it kind of worked out. In fact, if you go on the ATO's website now and sort of look up capital gains discount, that it has a line there saying, oh, if you bought an asset before, I think it's 30th of June, 1998, you can use the indexation method if you choose. But it actually has in brackets say, however, it is more advantageous usually to use the discount rate. They're actually clear that this is better off. And what it did is it just set fire to negative gearing. We went from sort of having about 2 or 3% negative gearing to getting over 12%, 13, 14, 15% of taxpayers negative gearing. And it just took off and became, something that every accountant was telling anyone who had a house to do so. And at that same time, I don't know if anyone can remember, but back then, suddenly you started seeing these ads by banks saying, equity, mate. It was all, suddenly you've got a home, we'll use the equity on that to buy an investment property because values are going up, you're going to be able to negative gear it, great for your tax, that'll lower your income tax, and then when you sell it, you're doing well because you're not losing out on capital gains. In fact, you're actually doing better. So suddenly in 1999, 2000, the market was just totally biased in a way it never has. And and it's one of the things that actually, because interest rates have gone down, negative gearing numbers have slightly gone down. But ironically, because interest rates have gone up, when the tax figures for this current year come out in a couple of years' time, I'm sure you're going to see an absolute boom in the numbers of people who are negative gearing.
Thank you. I want to add to this because I certainly in my job hear from investors like, if it weren't for negative gearing, we sort of need this, goal is negative cash flow properties. It's a little bit chicken and egg. And I want to be clear, all else being equal, you're better off having positive cash flow than negative cash flow on your property. But people think that what's happened is all these properties have negative cash flow, so we need negative gearing. What's actually happened is the option of negative gearing has made all these investors willing to buy properties with negative cash flow. If you didn't have negative gearing, people wouldn't buy these properties for the prices that they're buying them at. And it's quite weird to me. This market exists because of negative gearing. Negative gearing caused this. It's not a response to this.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask now if people have questions for our panel. We've got a microphone down here. You can come and ask your questions. Please make sure it's a question and not a speech. Thank you very much. That's my Tony Jones hat on there. I did want to come back. Please, if you've got a question, come on up. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm just curious if governments have a conflict of interest because they rely at the local and state level so much on property taxes and rates that they sort of like cry crocodile tears on the housing affordability front, but they're raking it in on funding roads and so forth.
Greg, do you
Yeah,
want to
I
take that
mean,
one?
definitely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there has been sort of calls for moving away from stamp duty tax, not only because stamp duty does provide a disincentive on actually selling your home and perhaps downsizing, which would actually help open up a bit of supply. But yeah, it's something that, you know, certainly the New South Wales government has absolutely loved the past decade, because stamp duty taxes have gone massively up, and
Of course, the reverse of that is in downturns, then that affects state budgets, doesn't it?
yeah, but one of the wonderful things about the housing market is the governments know that governments will do all they can to ensure that the housing market doesn't go down. And as we've seen, you know, I mean, it's not just Australia, but you know, the fact that we had the fastest growth in prices in pretty much, you know, as far back as the ABS is kind of counting, during a pandemic, during a recession. You know, there was no correlation with employment, with incomes, with anything like that. It's you know, I hesitate to call it a Ponzi market, which you often hear, but it is certainly one which is artificially bolstered by governments who politically and perhaps revenue wise gain from that bolstering.
Next question. Thank you.
So I just wanted to ask if there's any research that you've done on the actual mean income rather than the average income, because it's $48,000 less than the average income. And of course, that's half of the population that's below the mean income. So I think it's using the average income skews things a bit.
Yeah.
The other thing that I did want to state about the ACT I used to work in the housing organisation, and I've worked in the community sector and the social sector. And even ACT is the wealthiest state with the highest average income, has 30% of their people living below the poverty line, and 60% of those people are children, and people are sleeping in their cars. And so even in the wealthiest states, this happens. So
Do you have a question?
I do have a question. Would we look at using mean income instead of average income?
Yeah, Greg, do you want to take
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, sorry. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the median income is about 65,000, and the average income's, you know, about 85, depending on whether you know, that's sort of a national figure. And of course, if you look over time, it's massively become skewed. But I think you guys are probably better to talk about that sort of because this is one of the things we often get trapped into with housing. We do talk about people who either can afford to buy a house or even sort of, you know, renting and, you know, just want a more secure renting. But it's that the homeless and those who are really being slaughtered by the market, who are probably more in your guys' field.
Exactly as the person who asked the question, who made the comment said, it's really hard and really expensive to be poor in a rich city. You know, it's a lot harder because everything is more expensive. Everything is geared towards public servants here on higher incomes. You know, it's all geared towards that. And we, in my day job at Anglicare Australia, we have seen what that looks like on the front line. We know of families who sleep in tents. We know of people who sleep in their cars. We know of people who couch surf for months at a time because they can't find a place to rent. So it's absolutely, you know, I think you can look at a wealthy place like Canberra and fall into a bit of complacency, but it's a hard place to be poor.
And Maiy, what does that look like for the impact that it has on people's lives? If you're a family who got kicked out of your rental, or, you know, you've had to move to a different suburb, like what kind of implications does that have for someone?
So it impacts people on every level. So people who've just maybe had a rent increase, so let's, people who are not super on the front lines of the crisis, but say they're renting and they're one of the people who's had an increase of about 10% in the last year. It means you can't save. It means you have no buffer. And, you might think that's no big deal, but,
until you crack a tooth or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Until you have some kind of unexpected cost. But then there are people who, it means they're moving their children around every few years. It means that they're skipping meals for themselves so that they can feed their children. It means that they're sometimes not able to put food on the table. We're seeing a really big rise over the last few years in payday loans and buy now, pay later products. And a big part of that is just because people are so wiped out from paying the rent. And that leaves you in a debt spiral. And, it's a poverty trap. People get trapped in poverty because people will do anything to pay the rent.
Yeah.
It's also a real risk that more so than in the past, especially for women who have been in relationships, married, and if they have a divorce and the house is sold and maybe they get half and they can't afford now to actually have a house with their kids in the way that they used to. It's that real sort of pressure of, oh God, I almost have to stay together, not for the kids, but for the house,
Women are, I've veered off the original question, but women and their children are actually really huge losers out of this system. I don't love to cite a lot of statistics, but one of the ones that I find really shocking and sad is that last year, 7,000 women returned to domestic violence relationships because their only other option was to become homeless, and 9,000 women did become homeless. Because they needed to leave their relationship, and there's no housing option out there for them.
It's pretty awful. Next question.
Can you tell us about the availability of accessible housing for the frail-aged or the disabled? Is that a worse situation than for the general
Joel, do you want to take
people?
that one?
I'll have a crack at it. Thank you. So I don't know all the ins and outs of this. What I do know is that last year there was changes proposed to the National Construction Code, which would require new buildings, I think once it came into effect, to meet different accessibility standards. I think there were 3 sort of levels of that. And I think what sort of ended up happening is all the construction ministers from different states, it's like, yeah, okay, bronze sounds about good. And then they went back to their states and some jurisdictions did it and some jurisdictions didn't do it. If someone else on the panel has a better picture on that, jump in. I just want to speak. So you sort of asked about accessibility for the frailly aged. We'll throw to Maiy in a moment. We certainly hear from a lot of people with disability, regardless of their age, who in this rental market, their chances of finding a property that's suitable for them is very low. And if they do find a property, whether they feel comfortable requesting modifications is really a grey area. I've seen articles about people who requested modifications, NDIS paid to improve this house and make it more accessible, and then they got kicked out at the end of their tenancy, which is pretty grim. And survey data suggests that people with a disability face no-cause terminations at a higher rate. So I think it's a pretty rough market, but it really does compound other forms of marginalisation that may exist.
One of the things that we were chatting about backstage was about the implications of so much of our housing supply being dependent on random amateur investors. And this is a really good example of why that is a bad thing. Whenever you have any discussion of improving rental standards, accessibility is a part of that. The ability to retrofit and allow people to age in place is going to be really important as more and more renters retire and age in rentals. There's tons of pushback on that from landlords who just say, well, I'm just an average person. And it's like, yes, you are an average person. Perhaps you're the wrong person to be supplying an essential service to another human being, like housing.
Not a bad point. Next question.
Was making a house available for rent ever seen primarily as a contribution to the common good as opposed to just a way to make money? And if so, what sort of policy settings would be helpful for government to move more in that direction of the common good?
Greg, I'm going to throw to you on that one.
Good question. To be honest, historically, renters have never been lauded for their desire for the common good. Even Adam Smith sort of had a slap at renters back in his book, which is now sort of cited as this glory of the market, but he was a bit of an enemy of renters, or rentiers, I should say,
Yes.
not renters. Certainly, and I think just like with all things, whenever we try and think, okay, can we come up with some settings so that the market will be nice, the market works a way to not be nice, whether it's carbon credits or whatever. And so my argument would be no. And so take it away from the private sector and give it to the public sector, who actually have a responsibility to act in the common good.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Hi, I'm just interested in comments on alternative ways of solving the problem of housing people. We just seem to talk about we need more houses. It seems like the idea is that the right number of houses is one per person, because at the moment we're averaging like 1.5 people live in each house. And I know back in the day, like on my street, there used to be 80 people living on that street. There's now a dozen or 20 maybe, because every house had 6 children. Now half of them have no children and the others have 1 or 2. And I see that, Europe has suddenly housed, I don't know what, 1 million Ukrainians or something. And I've got relatives who've put up people in their houses. We've got 5 in our household and 1 child's going overseas, so we're taking on a boarder. And I know there's a group called Home Share that facilitates a house and putting people together.
The Australia Institute's done quite a number of reports with Home Share.
It just feels like there's got to be another way of doing it. Like in the group of people here, how many people live in a 4-bedroom house? And there's only 1 or 2 people there. And I'm thinking we don't have a shortage of bedrooms in Australia. We've got a shortage of access to those.
Yeah, really fantastic point. And if anyone's got the time, jump onto the Australia Institute website, and some of the submissions and reports that we've done with Home Share are really fantastic, as are some of the reports that we've done with the Nordic Policy Centre, looking at housing cooperatives and what the policies for that look like in the Nordic countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Which is kind of a bit more of a hybrid model. And you've just made me think, I'm a single person who lives alone, and I often think, without kids, what am I going to do when I retire? I don't want to go into an old age home, and I've got a rough plan for like a Golden Girls type situation. And my friends and I often look online and think, well, if we all sell at the same time and buy in together, maybe we could afford a nurse to come in once a week, and like I've got serious plans for that, because it doesn't seem like the private market is going to solve that that problem for me. But does anyone else have any comments on what some of those alternative models might look like?
I think I'll start by saying that there is a big misconception in Australia that we've got this huge supply problem. We have never had more homes per head of population in Australia than we do right now. They're not translating into affordable rentals, and the market has never been less affordable. We have had many less dwellings per head of population than we have now, and we've managed to be more affordable at every point in our history right up until now. So there's more going on here than just the need to build. I realize that's not what the question was about, but I did want to say that because it's something that drives me slightly bonkers. There are ways to promote people kind of sharing. I was actually going to talk about older people. There's lots of options in different parts of the world and even different parts of Australia that are a bit more kind of proactive than the ACT. There's ways for older people to live in demountables with their grown children, and it gives everybody a bit of space. Planning laws don't really make that possible in the ACT. There's models of co-sharing where everybody gets a little structure, and then there's a kind of shared facility in the middle. Again, it's not possible to do in the ACT at the moment, but New South Wales does allow it. So there are ways to and benefits of sharing, especially as you get older. And I would also say some of this stuff is a bit driven by the fact that wealthier people are taking up more and more space, and they're hoarding more and more houses, which is one of the reasons why we need to talk about the distribution. Yes, we don't have a shortage of rooms, but we need to think about how we've created tax and policy settings such that wealthy people can take up so much space.
And home share, for people who don't know, is an idea where older people who want to age in their own homes generally offer a bedroom or space in their homes to a younger person, perhaps a student, who might, in exchange for cheaper rent, be able to go and do their shopping once a week or help them go to the chemist and, things like that. I hope I've explained that all right. Rod Campbell, if you're watching online, don't murder me if I've got that wrong. Next question.
We've already touched on some of the issues we face in the ACT with housing. Yep. Is that better? Yeah. We've already touched on some of the very severe problems we face in housing in the ACT. They include 5-year wait times for public housing, about 2,000, 1 in 250 people, by best estimates, homeless, some of the highest rents in the country. Any advice for social movements, activists who in this city trying to raise some of these issues and drive political change? Thank you.
Joel, I'm going to throw to you first. Who started Better Renting?
Yeah. Gosh, I need to think about what is the true answer to this question and think about what I'm going to say tonight to this audience. I guess I come at this less as a policy person and more as a politics person, which is often how you actually matter to get these outcomes. I mean, at the bottom line, it is about what is going to be a political consideration for the government. Like when they're thinking about how they get re-elected and whether they get re-elected, what they think is going to matter to the population. I think social housing is an interesting example of this because, as Maiy said, there's not a big constituency in social housing. And I think probably a frank assessment is there's not that big a constituency outside social housing who's making that their number one issue that determines how they vote. And I think there's both the reality of what they care about, and then I guess there's the perception of what people care about. This can definitely be a vocal minority, and we certainly see that on housing issues in the ACT. That can get a lot of traction. So I can't give you sort of the easy answer, but I think that's probably the starting point is how do we make this an issue and how do we create a situation. I actually think someone from the Australian Institute made this point. You either want to create a problem for the government or be offering them a solution. And sometimes you can do both on the same issue. You become the problem, but then you also offer them the solution that you want, which is maybe a way to be doing it. But it's a pretty big question.
It is a really big question, and Joel and I have talked a lot about how do we build the political power of people who are using housing and are in need of housing, because right now, I get a lot of questions all the time about, but this poll says this and this poll says this, and there's no shortage of polls that tell you that people want more social housing built. There is no shortage of polling telling you that people want this or that change. But the problem is that the people who want that aren't as politically powerful as the interests that stop it from happening. And I think there's an open question that we still haven't worked out the answer to about how we make that a more politically powerful constituency.
Yeah, I mean, change is coming, and we can see that just in the last couple years, or in the last year with the election result, the by-election result in Aston. The most shocking sort of bit of stats that I came across when I was writing my article was that for the first time, people aged sort of in their early 30s, a minority own their home. That's the first time. Before, all generations before it, at least a majority owned, and if we go back to people in their early 30s in the 80s, you're close to 2/3. And what that means is that historically about 82%, maybe up to 85% of people when they retire own their home. By the time millennials get there, if they continue on the same trajectory, we're looking at maybe 2/3, if that, own their own home. And this is a constituency which is very quickly becoming the plurality in the electoral system, and they're pretty angry, and they are not getting as conservative as their Gen X brothers and sisters and their boomer parents were when they got to the age of 40 or so. They are staying angry. And there are a plethora of reasons, from climate change to everything, but you can bet housing is a big one. If you're at a point when you're in your 40s, you're working, got a good job, and you can't even get a house, you're not going to start thinking, well, life's pretty cool. I can put my feet up and, the kids can carry on however they want. You're still feeling like I've missed out, I'm angry. And hopefully, I think we have seen that certainly in the independents tapping into this, but hopefully the Labor Party will wake up and realise that there is a big market of people who are just begging for action.
You look like you want to say something else there, Joel.
Greg said it very well.
I was just going to add to that. I think there's two things. One is just an observation from my colleague Alan Beam, who talks about the fact that how can a nation be secure if its people don't feel secure, and not having a secure roof over your head is a pretty destabilizing thing for a lot of people, as Greg was just alluding to. And there is the potential for that to become, a real electoral force, I guess. And then the other observation, this is just completely off the top of my head. We were talking, Maiy, about the fact that when something is more universal as an entitlement, then people have a bigger stake in it. It occurs to me we've got pretty poorly paid aged care workforce, dire need for better aged care. Perhaps bringing them into defence housing and having aged care housing as a start. I can imagine if aged care workers could get access to more affordable homes, teachers might want it, nurses might want it. We could start to build a constituency there politically. That's my 2 bobs worth.
Nice little thought off the top of your head. You might have to. Also, just to plug us, if you are interested in pursuing positive, pragmatic, and great policies, you can always donate to the Australia Institute.
Thanks, Greg. Got there before me. Thanks very much. We'll do one last question and then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
Hello. Oh, yep, there we go. I don't speak into a lot of microphones. I'm sorry. One of the things, we clearly need a lot of social housing, yesterday.
Can you talk a little bit further?
Sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. Hello. So one of the things everyone seems to agree on is that we need more social housing pretty much like yesterday. There needs to be a lot of it very quickly and so on. But in the quest to put up a lot of affordable and accessible homes, how do you deal with the fact that they need to be in accessible areas? So if you have to get a lot of low-income people into one area, it doesn't help if it's a massively car-dependent suburb, because then you've got that. And then health, education, and kind of so on, ancillary costs of living. How do you deal with that as a bigger problem?
Yeah, great question. Does anyone else want to jump in with how to solve that housing crisis in particular?
Yeah, I think I think the answer is just to scatter it around. The answer is not just to build. The answer is also for the government to buy. I mean, I say build social housing, but the government can also buy homes. There's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing that. There have been times in our history where we've had distressed assets, where we've had people wanting to sell. That's always a really good opportunity for the government. It would be great to see them buy out some of these people who probably shouldn't be landlords. And that's a really good way of scattering people into established suburbs. It is also a good idea to build medium density, in the inner city and make sure that people have access to the amenities that they need. But yeah, completely agree. It is a really bad idea to just put people in one suburb, in a sprawling suburb that's really far away.
We're going to wrap it up there. Please give a big round of applause to our panel this evening. Greg, Maiy, and Joel. Thank you to everyone who asked all those fantastic questions. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Housing is such a big issue, but a bit of a hard one to talk about, I think. So we really appreciate you coming out tonight. Thanks to Verity Lane Market. Don't forget to head on downstairs and grab something to eat or something from the bar before you go. We love the venue here, and so we want to support them. Don't forget to sign up on our mailing list if you aren't on there already to hear about our next Politics in the Pub. Next month will be our post-budget politics in the pub. I'm not quite sure what our lineup will be or if Greg will be on that one, but we're definitely going to do one. So please come along to that one. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. It's where we explain big economic issues in plain English. And this week we're talking about the great big gas ripoff, which is basically how to reform the petroleum resource rent tax. Because there's nothing I love more than talking about tax reform, as you all know. Don't forget to chip in if you can at the tap and go or the donate box on the way out the door. And thank you again for coming out this evening. We love seeing all your faces, and we'll see you next month. Cheers, everyone.